Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero, and welcome to a special Friday edition of Red and Blue. If you're looking for The Takeout with Major Garrett, it is available to stream at CBSNews.com. A key witness in the impeachment investigation publicly testified Friday she felt threatened by comments from the President of the United States. Marie Yovanovitch is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. She appeared before the House Intelligence Committee. Yovanovitch was abruptly recalled from her post in May. During her testimony, she described a, quote, smear campaign against her, orchestrated by the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. She said she was unclear of his motives and insisted numerous allegations made against her were not true.
Individuals who apparently felt stymied by our efforts to promote stated U.S. policy against corruption, that is, to do our mission, were able to successfully conduct a campaign of disinformation against a sitting ambassador using unofficial back channels.
Yovanovitch was fired before that highly scrutinized phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's leader. You will recall that conversation happened in July. Republicans say that means she lacks firsthand knowledge relevant to the investigation.
Were you involved in the July 25th Trump-Zelensky phone call or preparations for the call?
No, I was not.
Were you involved in the deliberations about the pause in military sales to Ukraine as the Trump administration reviewed newly elected President Zelensky's commitment to corruption reforms?
For the delay in...
For the pause.
The pause? No, I was not.
Were you involved in the proposed Trump-Zelensky, later Pence-Zelensky meetings in Warsaw, Poland on September 1st?
No, I was not.
Did you ever talk to President Trump in 2019?
No, I have not.
Mick Mulvaney?
No, I have not.
Many Republicans repeated that the president can remove an ambassador at any time. Yovanovitch says she is not disputing that, but suggested her experience was part of a broader effort to undermine U.S. interests in Ukraine.
At the closed deposition, I expressed grave concerns about the degradation of the Foreign Service over the past few years and the failure of State Department leadership to push back as foreign and corrupt interests apparently hijacked our Ukraine policy. I remain disappointed that the department's leadership and others have declined to acknowledge that the attacks against me and others are dangerously wrong.
We know the president did discuss Yovanovitch and her reputation with Ukraine's leader. According to a summary of that July phone call, Mr. Trump called her, quote, bad news and suggested she, quote, is going to go through some things. Here was Yovanovitch's reaction to that.
I was shocked and devastated that I would feature in a phone call between two heads of state in such a manner where President Trump said that I was bad news to another world leader and that I would be going through some things. So I was, it was a terrible moment. A person who saw me actually reading the transcript said that the color drained from my face. I think I even had a physical reaction.
And as Yovanovitch was testifying about President Trump's attacks, he doubled down. On Twitter, he wrote, everywhere Yovanovitch went, quote, turned bad. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff said during the testimony these comments could amount to witness intimidation. While all this was happening, a new witness was testifying behind closed doors Friday. David Holmes is a political counselor at the American Embassy in Ukraine. A source told CBS News Holmes' testimony was, quote, very damning for Ambassador Gordon Sondland. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins me from Capitol Hill. Hi, Olivia. What more are you hearing about Holmes' deposition Friday?
Hi, Tanya. So we're standing in the basement right here, just outside of the doors where Holmes is testifying in a closed session with the members who have chosen to stay late on this Friday evening. And by all accounts, we've just gotten a remarkable piece of his testimony, namely from his opening statement, which describes and fills in a whole lot of the details of the circumstance in which he was able to overhear that conversation between President Trump and Ambassador Sondland. Some broad broad contours, Holmes essentially says that he goes out to a restaurant with two other staffers and Ambassador Sondland. They have a bottle of wine, at which point the ambassador says, I'm going to call President Trump and update him on some of the meetings that we have here. We're learning a lot more about what exactly Holmes overheard, including that he was hearing Ambassador Sondland's conversation with the president, obviously. So he said he heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation? Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do, quote, anything you ask him to. There's much more from that opening statement, too, Tanya.
So we know that Ambassador Sondland has changed some of his story before, after hearing what, Ambassador Taylor and others had testified. How can we expect Ambassador Sondland to respond to Holmes's testimony? Will he have to testify again?
Well, it's anyone's guess how he will respond, but he is scheduled to do so next week. I believe it's Wednesday. His lawyer already, in response to the developments when we first heard about Holmes via Bill Taylor's testimony, said that, that is when Sondland's response was going to be forthcoming during that public testimony next week. It's anyone's guess at the moment whether Sondland is going to recall this call. It seems like it's going to be pretty hard not to, given the amount of detail we're learning about from Holmes's testimony. Because he says some other things that are pretty specific details. Holmes says he has a clear recollection that these statements were made, even though he was not taking notes. He says that he had two other colleagues there who are probably also in a position to remember what Ambassador Sondland said. And he's got details beyond just the Zelensky-Ukraine conversation, because Kim Kardashian makes an appearance in the context of, of course, the matter of ASAP Rocky that was ongoing at the time.
All right, Olivia Gazis on Capitol Hill, thank you so much. Let's bring in our panel now. Jill Colvin is a White House reporter for the AP. Siobhan Hughes is a Capitol Hill reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Rikki Klieman is a CBS News legal analyst. Jill, let me start with you. One of the concerns about the hearings is how these witnesses have already provided this testimony behind closed doors. So did Yovanovitch say anything new today that could change the course of the inquiry?
I think that the impact of Yovanovitch sitting there was the public being able to watch this woman who came off as a very sympathetic character, talking about the way that this campaign to try to get her removed from her position had impacted her personally. You had that really powerful moment as they were talking about what she described as feeling was intimidating conduct by the president. Sort of, she'd interpreted the comments during that phone call with Zelensky as a threat against her. You had the president at that same time tweeting an attack against her as the hearing was going on, and then you had Adam Schiff actually pulling up, a copy of those tweets and reading them to her and having her respond to them in real time. And so even though we had already the transcript released of what she had said and sort of understood the narrative of the picture she was painting, I think it's a very different thing to hear that in her words and for the American public to be able to weigh that testimony for themselves.
And so, Rikki, as we mentioned, there's been a lot of focus on the tweets and how Yovanovitch said she felt intimidated by them, and also her feeling about the smear campaign. And you and I discussed earlier whether all of this could also construe defamation. I mean, whether Yovanovitch might have a libel case.
She might, but I think that you have to always make a decision if you're going to go forward with litigation, especially something as difficult to prove as libel, that you've really got to decide that you're willing to go through more pain. One of the things that happened today, I think, is that you have a woman who has gone through a public humiliation, first a private humiliation between the two leaders in the phone call of July 25th, now a public humiliation yet again of reliving the smear campaign and then getting tweeted about or tweeted at, if you want to look at it as a possible abuse of power, obstruction of justice in intimidation of a witness. And this is a woman who would have to decide, does she want to litigate this issue? But in terms of the elements of libel per se, which makes it a very clear case if you could prove additional damages, it's about her ability to act within her professional capacity. Right. So I leave that to her and to some very good First Amendment lawyer. By the way, there is a defamation suit currently pending against President Trump. The judges are allowing it to go forward, although he is a sitting president. It's a civil suit, and that's brought by Summers Zervos. This is a woman who was a contestant on The Apprentice. She accused the president of sexual assault. He called her a liar. She's suing for defamation.
So
and the case
is,
yes, there is precedent that a case can go forward.
All right. So when it comes to strategy, we saw Republicans repeatedly emphasize how Yovanovitch was recalled from her post in May. Do GOP House members feel they accomplished what they needed to today with this type of messaging that, you know, she was not a firsthand witness, she never spoke to the president, she has no idea of what his intent was, she was an ambassador serving at his pleasure, so why are we even really talking to her?
Well, it's a very thin thread on which to hang their argument, and Republicans don't have a lot to work with right now. You're right. They made the point that she didn't speak to Mick Mulvaney. She didn't speak to President Trump. She couldn't have been on that July 25th call. She had been ousted 2 months prior. And what Democrats say is that essentially, this is the origins of the pressure campaign. What we saw today was not the pressure campaign itself, but an attempt to get rid of an ambassador who would have stood in the way of that irregular channel through which the pressure campaign was carried out.
Right. And so, Jill, President Trump says that he watched part of the hearings today. Let's take a listen to some of his reaction.
And I'll tell you about what tampering is. Tampering is when a guy like Shifty Schiff doesn't let us have lawyers. Tampering is when Schiff doesn't let us have witnesses, doesn't let us speak. I've been watching today. For the first time, I started watching, and it's really sad when you see people not allowed to ask questions. It's totally, nobody's ever had such horrible due process. There was no due process. And I think it's considered a joke all over Washington and all over the world.
So should we expect the White House's strategy to shift at all now that we're in the public phase of proceedings, Jill?
You know, this is always a really complicating, factor for the White House communication shop. You know, their message going into this has been the president is hard at work. He doesn't have time to watch the proceedings. They're boring. He's not interested. They had said this morning that he intended to watch just the opening statement from the Republican chief of that committee, and then he'd be going back to his day job. Obviously, that's not what happened, as the president literally live tweeted parts of the hearing, retweeted an endless stream of reactions, and then responded to it there at that White House event. And you've got a president who is also sort of misrepresenting the way that this process is playing out. Both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, agreed to how these public proceedings were going to play out. Each side given 45 minutes for their opening, each member then giving a turn to ask questions. But what the president here appears intent on continuing to do is to try to undermine the process, to insist that he did nothing at all wrong here, and to paint this all as just a continuing witch hunt as he tries ahead of the 2020 election to kind of rev up his supporters and say, look, they're trying to undo the vote of 2016, and they're going to try to do it again for 2020.
And of course, these proceedings, as we said over and over again, are not legal proceedings. It is purely a political proceeding. So, Jill, the lawyer for the House Democrats, Daniel Goldman, asked Yovanovitch about President Trump's claim Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. Let's listen to that exchange.
Now, are you familiar with these allegations of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election?
I mean, there have been rumors out there about things like that, but, there was nothing hard, at least nothing that I was aware of.
There was nothing based in fact to support these allegations?
Yes.
And in fact, who was responsible for interfering and meddling in the 2016 election?
Well, the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that it was Russia.
So, Jill, is there any concern within the administration or even beyond the administration that the White House can't get past this narrative of Ukrainian interference in 2016?
Well, look, this is a conspiracy theory that has been pushed by some elements of the right. It's a conspiracy theory that Rudy Giuliani has been hooked on for years now. This is the reason why President Trump, in his conversation in July with President Zelensky, mentioned, the 2016 campaign. Part of the reason why he's pushing for these investigations is because he seems to believe, or at least, is willing to entertain the idea that Ukraine played a role in election interference, despite what the U.S. intelligence communities have stated loud and clear. And you've got a president here who, for years has been obsessed with trying to counteract this narrative, these facts that Russia intervened in the 2016 election to try to help him win. But the problem here is that every time the president fixates on that issue, it just draws more attention to that issue. And this is something the White House has had to contend with from day one. You've got a president who, when he's angry about something, when something's on his mind, he makes it very clear to allies, to people he speaks with on the phone, and to the American public. He's somebody who's just not very doesn't have much of a history of kind of keeping those things to himself, which just draws further attention to them.
And Siobhan, the White House released a summary of a second call with Ukraine's leader. This conversation happened in April, before the now highly scrutinized phone call at the center of this investigation. What did we learn from the now public memo?
Well, what we learned is that it differed from the readout the White House had provided right after that call took place. According to the transcript today, the call was very cordial, but it did not talk about corruption, and it did not talk about ensuring the territorial integrity of Ukraine, two things that the initial readout had indicated Donald Trump had brought up. And so that just raised more questions for Democrats.
And Jill, tomorrow, we know that a career employee at the White House Office of Management and Budget is expected to testify. Many think that his testimony is going to be among the most important, because if you really want to follow the money and the tick-tock of when and where and how and why the money was withheld, he could be one of the most important witnesses. So what exactly are lawmakers hoping to learn from Mark Sandy?
At this point, I think, lawmakers are interested in kind of any details they can figure out about the back and forth that happened here, more about this back channel, potentially more about these conversations that the president was having potentially with State Department officials. We know he was on the phone at least once with Ambassador Sondland, discussing potentially, his interest in these investigations. But you've kind of got this dynamic right now where we've still got this split screen between, individuals coming and testifying publicly and individuals continuing to testify behind the scenes. And, we'll see over the course of the next week or so, as more and more witnesses come forward and speak publicly, kind of whether that shifts public perception about this at all.
All right. Well, Jill Colvin and Siobhan Hughes, thanks to you both. We really appreciate you joining us. Rikki Klieman, please stand by, because we're going to speak to you a little more in a bit.